Maverick News. The world is watching.
Hey, no, it's too much.
Maverick News. Fighting for freedom.
I'm back. Populism. Populism. It's growing and stalling and shrinking and growing, and it is hard to define and understand what it is, where it is, who we are, who they are. It's perhaps one of the most difficult things politically to define and understand. But we need to talk about it. At least I think we need to. I want to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about it. Because it's about Trump. It's about the PPC, the People's Party of Canada. It's about Maxime Bernier, the leader of the PPC. It's about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's about Bernie Sanders. It's about everything that we see going on politically right now. In many ways, it's sort of at the heart of it all, and yet on the fringe at the same time. And why is that? It's because it's attracting people from across the political spectrum. What is it? Well, if you look up the definition of what populism is, it's the member, or what a populist is, it's the member of a party or a political party that represents the common people. And that word common keeps coming up. It means slightly different things in different ways, and depending on what context it's used in, but common, the common people, us, common people. Even in Canada, we have the House of Commons, right? House of the people, the People's House. And there's a similar approach in the US. But it's hard to define and understand. I've got a lot of notes that I wrote down during the afternoon when I was thinking about this. Let's try and keep my thoughts straight. And why do I want to talk about it? Because I think largely our audience is made up of populists. I think most of you are in one way or another populists. And yet most of you, or I would say that the demographics of the people watching this program, of the people who are involved in the populist movements in Canada and the US, and even other countries around the world, they come from various political ideologies. Some are on the left and some are on the right. That makes populism very difficult to understand and define. So where did it come from? This is very revealing. Populism here in North America really got its start in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, from about 1860 to 1890. The population in the United States was exploding. In fact, during that period of time, it actually just about doubled. And by 1890, the population in the US was about 62 million people, about double the size of what Canada has right now. And during that time, the economy was booming. It was exploding in a positive way. Jobs were being created. The steel industry took hold. Steel production was increasing. Energy production, coal mining, it was all booming. And because the population was expanding, people, farmers, well, there was more demand for food, right? Because the population was increasing so quickly. And in order to keep up with the rising demand for food, farmers were beginning to mechanize and use technology to increase productivity and increase yields. How were they doing that? Mostly with steam. But those machines, those steam driven tractors and harvesters, they cost a lot of money and a lot of farmers couldn't afford them. So what did they do? They went to the big elite bankers in the East and took out big loans in order to buy these big machines. Most of them thinking that because the economy was expanding so quickly, they would be able to pay those loans off in a short period of time because of the increasing demand for food. But here's where the parallels between those times and today's times begin to emerge. History begins to rhyme as the farmers of those years experienced basically a pretty severe recession. The price of food actually collapsed. And the government really, back in those days, didn't have social programs like we have today, bailout programs for farmers, crop insurance, things of that nature. And there were droughts. So yields actually decreased, and a lot of farmers ended up going bankrupt. And while all of that was going on, the rail companies increased rates. And the common man, the common farmer, all suffered and felt that they weren't truly and fairly represented politically and that nobody was looking out for their interests. And so during that time period, a lot of things were happening in the economy that, again, rhyme with what we're experiencing today. There was even there were even concerns back then about the viability and the longevity of the currency being used in those days, and whether we should or should not be on the gold standard. So all of this was raging at the time, and so the farmers kind of took matters into their own hands and forced their will upon the system by forming and organizing a populist movement that actually, and you're going to love this, they formed not just a political movement, but an actual party. And do you know what they called it? Oh, the irony. Or maybe the irony of history repeating itself and rhyming. They called it the People's Party. What do we have in Canada today? The People's Party of Canada. Why is it so difficult to define these things? Keep in mind that the People's Party of Canada, started by Maxime Bernier, the leader of the PPC, was actually with the former Harper government, which was conservative in Canada. He ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, lost by 1%. He was that close to becoming the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and then took a lot of his conservative supporters with him over to form the PPC. So to me, being someone pretty conservative in my views politically, the PPC was very attractive. And I thought Maxime Bernier was the guy to follow at the time, because I also felt like the Conservative Party had left me because they had gone too far left. And the PPC was the new home for homeless conservatives. That's the way I viewed the PPC. And I think at the time that's pretty accurate. I think that is what it was. In some respects, that's still part of it, but that's not really where it is anymore. Not in my estimation. And this is my analysis of not only the People's Party of Canada, but the entire populist movement that is underway right now. And for all you freedom fighters out there, you take note, because this, I think, will give you a better perspective on the status of where the freedom movement is at. So by 1891, farmers had formed these populist groups. And what did they do back then? What was their platform? What was their political rhetoric focused on? Well, the People's Party focused on targeting the elites, using exactly that word. And who are the elites? Same elites that they're focused on today, really. The bankers, the big money people. Maybe they didn't use the term globalist so much. Today it's a little bit different because, of course, we've been through World War II. And I think the globalist movement out there is largely based on the remnants of what was left over of Germany, or from Germany after World War II. And you know what I'm getting at there. I think there's a real heavy fascistic element to it. So there is that, but so many similarities, because back then the People's Party was made up of farmers, unions, working groups, working class, the common people. Groups like the Knights of Labor. So there was a definite socialist left-wing flavor to the populist movement of that time. But it wasn't all left-wing. It also attracted some very conservative, more right-wing elements. So just like today, back then, it really attracted people from across the political spectrum, and it blurred the lines, the political ideological lines, which again made it very difficult to identify, define, and even name. But that's really what was going on. And what did they want? They wanted a lot of exactly the same things. They targeted the same things then that are being targeted now by today's populists. They were pro-labor, pro-working class. They wanted, get this, regulation of railroads. What did we just see in East Palestine, Ohio? What do we keep hearing about in the rhetoric out there? All these concerns where they're, from the populist side, the freedom side, if you will, ongoing talk about the railroads, safety issues, the big corporations, the big railroad corporations, cutting corners, putting people's safety in jeopardy. And they advocated for women's suffrage, women's rights, an 8-hour workday, and a progressive income tax. All of those things very sort of labor-oriented, socialist in nature. So in many respects, it was, the populist movement from the very beginning had its roots in socialism, a form of socialism. On the social side, it was more, I guess, akin to more conservative points of view. And the movement also did absolutely attract some more of the fringer elements. As Preston Manning of the old Reform Party used to say, a bright light does attract some bugs. And of course, in those days, attitudes socially were a lot different. And so the racist element was fairly strong within certain parts of the populist movement. And I think that there is, to be quite frank and honest, an element of that emerging even today, where there's a lack of tolerance within the freedom movement. Not from everybody, but it's definitely emerged in the last number of months. Because, again, like Preston Manning of the old Reform Party said, a bright light tends to attract a few bugs. So it's there. Not to say that the other side, on the woke liberal side, not to say they don't have their issues too. They certainly do. And nobody's more intolerant than a liberal. But absolutely some reflections of the past glimmering and coming to the surface here today. So in 1892, the movement, the populist movement in the United States, had gained enough traction that they were actually able to nominate James B. Weaver, their leader, for president. And in 1892, he got 8% of the votes. And they captured 5 states. And in 1894, just 2 years later, they were able to send 8 members to Congress. So there was a rapid rise in the popularity of the populist movement and the People's Party in the US. But also reflective, very, just like today, back then, there was all this internal conflict. And I think it's indicative. It's just it's just typical, I think, of this kind of populist movement, that there is internal conflict. I think it's inevitable when you have a movement that is created with people from across a political spectrum. They share some common things, or sometimes even a common goal, but over time, their differences also begin to emerge. And as their focus on the things that they share in common begins to wane, the differences begin to bubble to the surface, and you get conflict. I think we've seen that during the pandemic, where the populist movement gained a lot of traction. It became much more popular. A lot of people went to the People's Party. A lot of people joined the freedom movement because of the lockdowns, because everybody was focused on civil liberties issues. Anybody that was worried about freedom, lockdowns, the freedom movement obviously appealed very much to people who had civil liberties foremost in their minds. People like me, probably people like you. But as I've been saying for a long time, what does freedom mean? And where did the word freedom come from? How is it being applied here? Well, back, in the earliest days of the populist movement, it was called a populist movement. They referred to it as the People's Party, not like the Freedom Party. But what has happened, especially in Canada and in the US too, but especially in Canada, they've branded it. They've rebranded it as the Freedom Movement. But it's really a populist movement, which is also nationalist in focus. It's a form of nationalism, sort of. But they've rebranded it the Freedom Movement in order to keep that, I think, momentum going. But what have we seen in Canada over the last, 4 or 5, 6 months? A shift that some of the people are saying that the freedom movement is evolving. It needs to evolve, and they're trying to turn it into a unity movement. Well, that's another sidebar discussion for another night, perhaps, but worth noting this evening. Some people are trying to take things beyond the freedom movement, right? But it's still a populist movement. What those people promoting unity are really doing, in my estimation, is they are trying to promote a global populist movement with intersections, connections between different populist organizations, and I would say even common law organizations globally. And why does the word common law come up for me? Common. It's a populist movement representing the common man, the common person, the common people, common law. It ties together. But by 1896, there was so much internal conflict within the People's Party in the US, so much internal conflict within the whole movement that it had basically blown itself apart. And the party, the movement, had aligned itself with the Democrats at that point. Why? It was largely because of the racism. If you really want to know the truth, it was largely because of that. And the people back then involved in the movement aligned themselves more with the Republicans or with the Democrats. And that didn't sit well with a lot of black people, because most of them at the time identified or supported the party of Lincoln, the Republicans. But it was the Democrats back then that embraced a lot of the racism. The Democrats, that was really the party that started the KKK. Today, they try to put themselves out there and portray themselves as the tolerant party. We're the party of, we're the party that represents minorities, and we do the good. They do the bad. No, not really. Not really. So they aligned themselves with the Democrats, and then they actually, the Democrats at the time, they ran William Jennings Bryan for president. And he was actually populist in focus. So fast forward, and then you get Senator Huey Long during the 1930s, who put forward populist ideas, appropriated them, I guess, in a sense, during the Depression. And a lot of his ideas were very radical for the time. He promoted the idea of capping personal income at $50 million a year in today's dollars, when adjusted for inflation, which is a huge issue today. Maybe we should adjust that figure to like 100 million. By today's dollars, our dollars are losing value so quickly that might actually be proper, or more accurate. But Senator Huey Long, not everybody liked that guy. And he was assassinated in 1936. But his policies, his push for a left-wing socialist populist agenda, they actually forced, the socialist policies of the day, the New Deal, to be pushed even further to the left than they probably would have been otherwise. So you got more socialism injected into the US system at that time because of the populist movement. And as you move through time, you see that the ideological lines continue to be blurred, and you move up into now the 1950s. And who was really involved in the populist movement of those days? People like Senator Joseph McCarthy. He was, in his own way, a populist. And he represented, I think, more of the conservative element of the populism or the populist movement in the United States. And then you move forward again, and you find people like George Wallace. But of course, it all started way back with James B. Weaver. So I have some quotes from the man himself, James B. Weaver. Of course, back in the 1800s, not too many video cameras around, but we do have these quotes in this video. And I'm going to share them with you now. And just listen to what the words are. I think you'll find some similarities between what he says here and what we're being, what the politicians of today, the populist politicians and activists are pitching to us today as well.
Public sentiment is not observed. The wealthy and powerful gain a ready hearing, but the plodding, suffering, unorganized, complaining multitude are spurned and derided. The American people have entered upon the mightiest civic struggle known to their history. The Golden Rule is rejected by the heads of all the great departments of trade, and the law of Cain, which repudiates the obligations that we are mutually under to one another, is fostered and made the rule of action throughout the world. Corporate feudality has taken the place of chattel slavery and vaunts its power in every state.
Slavery.
Destiny is no matter of chance. It is a matter of choice. It is not a thing to be waited for. It is a thing to be achieved. Never be afraid to stand with the minority when the minority is right. For the minority which is right will one day be the majority. There are two ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you will only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak through on those below. The democratic idea, however, has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up through every class which rests upon them. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. Two people in a conversation amount to four people talking. The four are what one person says, what he really wanted to say, what his listener heard, and what he thought he heard. All the ills from which America suffers can be traced back to the teaching of evolution. It would be better to destroy every other book ever written and save just the first 3 verses of Genesis.
Even the references to farming, the language is so similar to what we're hearing today, in my view. Back then, it was about class warfare. Today, it is still about class warfare. And that's what's happening with the populist movement today. They're tapping into those same issues in very much the same way. And I think the populist movement also appeals very much to Christians, church-going folks. And I think that was the case back then too. And you saw that in that last quote. So history, I think, is rhyming. And when we come back, we'll take a look at where we're going now.
Greetings, brave Mavericks. Our quest for truth continues. We go beyond fake news. Together we expose propaganda. Together we pull others out of rabbit holes. We are maverick thinkers. We are all unique individuals, defenders of individual rights and freedoms, credible, trusted, grounded in reality. Maverick News, Maverick News. Defending free speech, free speech. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. Maverick News. The world is watching.
So I do want to take a look at some of the past, but this is a representation of where we're at right now today, too. This was a Freedom Rally just this past weekend in Shelburne, Ontario.
I don't know about you, the real reason I'm doing this, not for me, not even just for my beautiful wife, it's for the kid that I want to have, it's for the family I want to raise, and it's for the country that I grew up in, a country that I love, and a country that I don't want to see go down the wrong path.
And that, of course, Chris Sky, running for mayor in Toronto. And I think he does represent an element of the populist movement in Canada right now. One of the most prominent figures within the freedom movement in the country. But history, history, history. It really is rhyming, if not repeating. And so, as I say, as you move through time, and we talked about Senator Huey Long in the 1930s during the Depression, pushing sort of left wing, the socialist left wing elements of populism at the time, which probably was fueled by the Great Depression because the common man was suffering so much during the Great Depression. But then you zoom ahead into the 1950s, you get Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, that representing more of a conservative element within the populist movement. And then George Wallace. You get up into the 1960s. And then you want to talk about racism and that element of it. Well, he was a segregationist. And what did he do? Well, he used populist rhetoric focusing on the working class, and he tapped into anxiety, fear, resentment among, largely at the time, the white middle class, who were struggling to adjust to the sweeping social changes of the decade that flowed well into the 1970s. And at that time, there was a conservative, almost neocon flavor to it. But it wasn't really a neocon. I shouldn't say that. It was a more of a conservative flavor of populism because they attacked Vietnam War veterans. Remember, if people were burning the flag at the time, or if you were opposed to the Vietnam War, you might be called a pinko, communist sympathizer, Red Scare. At the time, that was more in line with what the populist movement was focused on. They would criticize liberals still, criticize the government, which they still do, and they would criticize the elite because it was still a movement of the common man. But at the time, there were certain elements of it that I guess today would be considered more on the right side of the political spectrum. Pro-war, pro-Vietnam War, because at the time you would be seen as being more pro-American if you were supporting the war because you were against communism and against the spread of communism overseas because you had to prevent it from getting here so we could fight the wars over there and not fight them here. That was the mindset of the time. And so in that way, it was a form of nationalism, an expression of nationalism in that sense. And that same mindset was in place in Canada as well. And I remember it right up into the 1970s. And I think that was, in a way, what was expressed even through the character of Archie Bunker in the television show All in the Family. I think in many respects, he was an expression of populism. So here's George Wallace. Back in 1968. And I think just listening to some of this will help you understand my my assessment of the social conditions and the state of populism at that time.
Governor Wallace, I'd like to ask you a question in the economic area. One of the major phenomena that America has experienced in the last several decades has been the mechanization of labor in rural areas, such that hundreds of thousands of people in your state and in many other states have been thrown into a state of near starvation, many of them being forced to migrate to the cities, particularly in the north. You've spoken a great deal about the obligations of local government. I wonder what you have done in Alabama, or what other southern governors have done to deal with the plight of this mass of people.
I cannot tell you what other southern governors may have done, but of course your statement that many people are near starvation is entirely incorrect and erroneous. We probably have people in our state, the same as in the state that you are speaking from, that have a deficient diet at times. But as far as anybody starving to death, that's simply not the case. Our system in this part of the country that grew up even after the war between the states that you don't necessarily like, I would say, which had some paternalism in it, has seen that this doesn't happen. But the mechanization of farming, of agriculture, has drawn many people from the rural areas into the large cities of our country unprepared for urban life. We have built a great number of junior colleges and trade schools in our state, and as a consequence, we today have them jammed to capacity with Negro and white students. We are attempting to solve this problem through education. Now, we find that many of our Negro citizens have gone to New Jersey, to Michigan, and to New York because politicians in those states have said it's so good here and it's so bad in Alabama. But we find that many of them who went there came back and said it's a lot better in Alabama than it was there.
Well, Governor, I've certainly...
How many came back?
I certainly am an advocate of higher education, and I commend you for the building of junior colleges, but that doesn't do much to ease the plight of families who have no jobs. Now,
Well,
I noticed 2 weeks ago that Justice Hugo Black of the Supreme Court ordered the state of Alabama to restore 20,000 children to the public welfare rolls there.
Yes, sir.
And there are many other reports from southern areas that people are in a state of severe malnutrition bordering on starvation.
Well, that's not correct. I would like to invite you gentlemen to come down and see for yourself, and you will say what many have said when they got here, that we've just been misled. Now,
well, there are a number of commissions that have gone down and have reported to the Congress and to the American people quite to the contrary.
Well,
Which
right,
commission,
but that doesn't
sir?
mean that the commissions are reporting truth, because we just don't have.
Well,
people
they're very
starving to death.
reputable members on these commissions.
Well, Professor Cloward, would you cite a specific commission report? And then we can ask the governor about
Well,
that.
there was a commission report that was filed just a few months ago
By whom?
by a group of organizations in the North, such as the Field Foundation. The commission was headed by Mr. Leslie Dunbar, formerly of the Southern Regional Council, and it was supported by a number of foundations, governmental organizations, and private individuals. And they had doctors who examined the condition of children, and very reputable physicians who had no particular stake in condemning the South.
Well, this exists where you have poverty, not only in Alabama and the South, but it exists in New York.
Well, it
It
does
exists in
exist
New
in
Jersey.
Alabama, sir? Is that what you're saying now?
I'm saying that what you're saying, you get the commissions to study Alabama, but where did the rioting and where did the breakdown of law and order come? Because they said conditions were intolerable. It wasn't in Alabama. We didn't have any breakdown of law and order. We didn't have any rioting.
Nobody said anything about
No,
rioting. It was a
No,
question
I know
about
you didn't say anything
poverty,
about
Governor.
rioting, but they say that
Well,
the
my
cause
question
of the
was about-
riots came because of poverty.
My question was
And
about
the lack-
economic policy. And,
Well, our economic policy is that
your public welfare system does not permit people on the rolls, especially children.
We did no. So here's what we had: a rule that I think is a common sense rule, that if a working, able-bodied man lived in the home, that even though he was not the father or the husband of the wife, but lived with the woman, lived with her in the home where the children were, and was working and able-bodied, then you couldn't put those children on aid-dependent children because.
But Governor, that amounts to saying that a man who has no legal liability for a family is going to be forced by the welfare system
Well,
to care for that family.
I think it's a pretty good rule when an able-bodied man lives with a woman and children as man and wife, even though they're not married, and lives in that household. That
and even though he's not employed.
no,
Even though there's no
sir, we
employment
didn't
for
say
him.
that. I said if he was employed. If he's unemployed, then of course they can get aid to dependent children. It was when an able-bodied man lived with a woman, the mother of the children, and had employment. They could not.
Governor, in your state, when a man is employed, the family cannot get public welfare. The point is he must leave that family. If he is indeed the father or the husband, he must desert that family before they can then go on to public welfare rolls. That happens to be true in many, many other states too.
Well, what you're saying, of course, is that you think that we ought to spend more on welfare, and I think we ought to get away from welfare and not pay able-bodied people.
Well, I'd be interested in your answer of how we could do that, Governor. What economic policies have you promulgated to care for people who have been displaced by machines in rural areas?
Well, I said that we have the
junior colleges, which
and trade school program, and another thing we've done.
How do people eat in the meanwhile?
Well, how do they eat in Alabama?
How do they eat while they're waiting to grow up to go to those junior colleges?
Well, they're eating in Alabama, and it's just not as bad as you've heard it happens to be. And
well, now,
let me answer. We got last year in our state, we had more new industry than I think any state save one in the South. $655 million of new and expanded industry. We haven't had the non-white unemployment problem in Alabama that you have in the FEPC states. In fact, the Department of Labor reported statistics that show there's less non-white unemployment. At least this was
Governor,
a year
I'm sorry.
ago.
Forgive me. Our time is up and we must leave now.
So a different kind of, or a different flavor of populism at that time. George Wallace. And I think it was a reflection or an expression of a different kind of nationalism too, but definitely a form of populism. So move forward into, today's modern era, and who are the populist figures that we see today? Well, Barack Obama, Democrat, but in many respects, he tapped into the populist movement with a lot of his policies, his focus on healthcare, for instance. That was the sort of the socialist side, the appeal to the common man that way. And Bernie Sanders was the same thing. He was in many respects a populist, adopting policies, socialist in nature, economic policies that focused on socialism, economic policies and social policies that focused on the working class to appeal to the working class. And that's why even someone like Donald Trump, who ran as a Republican, but really embodies the modern spirit of populism. And when he ran and won in 2016 for president, and he came down that escalator, it wasn't so much that he was a regular kind of Republican. He certainly wasn't a rhino. He was transforming the Republican Party. He was taking populism and inserting it right into the heart of the Republican Party. It was the MAGA movement. You're looking at the beginning of the MAGA movement right here. He came down that escalator and announced that he was running for president. And absolutely a populist. And the MAGA movement has really taken over the Republican Party. That's why he is really the leader of the Republican Party. He remains the guy to beat. As people like DeSantis and others look at challenging him for the nomination, for the Republican nomination to run as president again. in 2024. So that's a reflection. That's history rhyming. And what kind of policies has Trump embraced? What has he focused on during his time? Well, it's been, in many ways, sort of socialistic, hasn't it? He embraced things like tariffs, immigration, taxes, attacked the elite, the deep state, government, attacked media. These are all things that leaders within the populist movement in the past, even in the earliest days of the populist movement, that's largely what they focused on as well. That's why we've seen a shift in the political landscape, and why these labels that we attach to these political parties no longer really apply in many respects. When I think back to the 1980s and what the conservative movement was like at that time, back then, if you were a conservative, you were viewed as being part of the establishment, supporting the elite, supporting big corporations, Wall Street, or in Canada, Bay Street. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, architect of the free trade agreement, President Reagan, very kind of conservative at the time, but not so much socialist in focus. But Trump, absolutely, more of a protectionist. When he announced he was running for president, after he came down the escalator, what did he talk about? He immediately went to protectionism, tariffs. It appealed even to me at the time. When I was younger, I was against tariffs. I was very much pro-free trade. But my views on that on the economic side over time changed. It's evolved, and it became palatable to me, as it did to a lot of other people back in 2016. Why? Well, because it became pretty clear that the free trade agreements that had been installed prior really did benefit the big companies and not the common man. That they were designed to make corporations more profitable while limiting the ability of workers to earn a living. Why? Because goods could flow more freely back and forth across the border, in some cases completely duty-free, but not labor. So if a company outsourced jobs or just moved jobs to another country, you as a worker didn't have the right to leave your country and go work in the other country. You couldn't just move to Mexico and get a job down there in an auto factory, or you couldn't just up and leave Tennessee or Detroit and move to Mexico or Brazil to get a job in an auto plant. And that's exactly what Trump referred to in this speech when he announced he was going to run for president. Listen to him.
China's leaders and our leaders, they are ripping us. We are rebuilding China. We're rebuilding many countries. China, you go there now, roads, bridges, schools, you never saw anything like it. They have bridges that make the George Washington Bridge look like small potatoes, and they're all over the place. We have all the cards, but we don't know how to use them. We don't even know that we have the cards because our leaders don't understand the game. We could turn off that spigot by charging them tax until they behave properly. Now they're going militarily. They're building a military island in the middle of the South China Sea, a military island. Now, our country could never do that because we'd have to get environmental clearance. And the environmentalists wouldn't let our country. We would never build an ocean. They built it in about 1 year, this massive military port. They're building up their military to a point that is very scary. You have a problem with ISIS, you have a bigger problem with China. And in my opinion, the new China, believe it or not, in terms of trade, is Mexico. So this man tells me about the manufacturing. I say, that's a terrible story. I hate to hear it. But I have another one, Ford. So Mexico takes a company, car company, that was going to build in Tennessee, rips it out. Everybody thought the deal was dead, reported in the Wall Street Journal recently. Everybody thought it was a done deal. It's going in, and that's going to be it, going into Tennessee. Great state, great people. All of a sudden, at the last moment, this big car manufacturer, foreign, announces they're not going to Tennessee. They're going to spend their $1 billion in Mexico instead. Not good. Now Ford announces a few weeks ago that Ford is going to build a $2.5 billion car and truck and parts manufacturing plant in Mexico. $2.5 billion. It's going to be one of the largest in the world. Ford, good company. So I announced that I'm running for president. One of the early things I would do, probably before I even got in, and I wouldn't even use, I know the smartest negotiators in the world. I know the good ones, I know the bad ones, I know the overrated ones. You got a lot of them that are overrated. They're not good, they think they are. They get good stories because the newspapers get buffaloed. But they're not good. But I know the best negotiators in the world. And I'd put them one for each country. Believe me, folks, we will do very, very well. Very, very well. But I wouldn't even waste my time with this one. I would call up the head of Ford, who I know, if I was president. I'd say, congratulations. I understand that you're building a nice $2.5 billion car factory in Mexico, and that you're going to take your cars and sell them to the United States, zero tax, just flow them across the border. And you say to yourself, how does that help us, right? How does that help us? Where is that good? It's not. So I'd say, congratulations, that's the good news. Let me give you the bad news. Every car and every truck and every part manufactured in this plant that comes across the border, we're going to charge you a 35% tax. Okay? And that tax is going to be paid simultaneously with the transaction. And that's it. Now, here's what's going to happen. If it's not me in the position, it's one of these politicians that we're running against. You know, the 400 people that we're already against. And here's what's going to happen. They're not so stupid. They know it's not a good thing. And they may even be upset by it. But then they're going to get a call from their donors, or probably from the lobbyist for Ford, and say, you can't do that to Ford because Ford takes care of me and I take care of you, and you can't do that to Ford. And guess what? No problem. They're going to build in Mexico. They're going to take away thousands of jobs. It's very bad for us. So under President Trump, here's what would happen. The head of Ford will call me back, I would say within an hour after I told him the bad news. But it could be he'd want to be cool, and he'll wait till the next day. You know, they want to be a little cool. And he'll say, please, please, please. He'll beg for a little while, and I'll say, no interest. Then he'll call all sorts of political people, and I'll say, sorry, fellas, no interest, because I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I don't need anybody's money. I'm using my own money. I'm not using the lobbyists. I'm not using donors. I don't care. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second. And by the way, I'm not even saying that in a bragging. That's the kind of mindset, that's the kind of thinking you need for this country. So, because we got to make the country rich, it sounds crass. Somebody said, oh, that's crass. It's not crass. We got 18 trillion in debt. We got nothing but problems. We got a military that needs equipment all over the place. We got nuclear weapons that are obsolete. We've got nothing. We got Social Security that's going to be destroyed if somebody like me doesn't bring money into the country. All these other people want to cut the hell out of it. I'm not going to cut it at all. I'm going to bring money in, and we're going to save it. But here's what's going to happen. After I'm called by 30 friends of mine who contributed to different campaigns, after I'm called by all of the special interests and by the donors and by the lobbyists, and they have zero chance at convincing me, zero. I'll get a call the next day from the head of Ford. He'll say, please reconsider. I'll say no. He'll say, Mr. President, we've decided to move the plant back to the United States. We're not going to build it in Mexico. That's it. They have no choice. They have no choice. There are hundreds of things like that. I'll give you another example. Saudi Arabia. They make $1 billion a day. $1 billion a day. I love the Saudis. Many are in this building. They make $1 billion a day. Whenever they have problems, we send over the ships. We're going to protect. What are we doing? They got nothing but money. If the right person asked them, they pay a fortune. They wouldn't be there except for us. And believe me, you look at the border with Yemen. You remember Obama a year ago. Yemen was a great victory. 2 weeks later, the place was blown up. Everybody got, and they kept our equipment. They always keep our equipment. We just said used equipment, right? They always keep our equipment. We ought to send some real junk, because frankly, we ought to send our surplus. We're always losing this gorgeous brand new stuff. But look at that border with Saudi Arabia. Do you really think that these people are interested in Yemen? Saudi Arabia, without us, is gone. They're gone. And I'm the one that made all of the right predictions about Iraq. You know, all of these politicians that I'm running against now, it's so nice to say I'm running as opposed to if I run, I'm running. But all of these politicians that I'm running against now, they're trying to disassociate. I mean, you looked at Bush, it took him 5
So at the
days
time, all of that rhetoric
to
from
answer the
Trump
question on Iraq.
appealed
He
very
didn't
much to the
know.
common
He said,
person.
is he intelligent? Then I looked at Rubio.
Absolutely, or a populist message, a populist focus. A populist candidate, MAGA, a populist movement, nationalist in focus. Economic policies meant to appeal to the common person, the working class. Protectionism, tariffs, a nationalist foreign policy. And that's why at that time, you saw so much crossover in support from Bernie Sanders supporters to Trump. And when Sanders was cheated, essentially, out of the nomination for the Democrats, a lot of his supporters went to Trump. You wouldn't think, you know, if it was back in the 80s or the 90s, and it was a Republican versus a Democrat, a conservative versus a liberal, at that time, there wouldn't have been any way that a socialist supporter would have gone and crossed over to the Republican side. But with MAGA, there is this blurring of political ideologies. That's what populism does. It attracts people from across the political spectrum, where people come in because certain aspects of the movement appeal to a person on such a strong level, usually emotionally, that they'll attach themselves to the movement, to the party. In this case, I think more to the movement, and not really think too much about the other aspects of the political platform that the party or the movement has adopted. But again, that's why over time, those other factors come into play, and it's hard to keep it together. So yeah, we've seen populism appropriated over time by different politicians, from Barack Obama to Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump to Maxime Bernier of the People's Party of Canada. And if you go back and look at what has happened in Canada over time, a lot of these socialist movements, historically, people like Tommy Douglas and the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which has its roots in Western Canada. Populist movements that sprang up because of the struggles of the common man. That's where the socialism comes in. And then there's the nationalism on the other side, and even conservatism. It appeals to the common people. And it has always played on the fears, the anxieties, and the dreams of the people. Emotions. Those are the buttons they push. Always. To generate support. They tap into a lot of those concerns that people have, usually legitimate, in order to bring people in. Reform Party in Canada, Preston Manning. Again, a populist movement, very much a populist party. A forerunner, really, to today's People's Party of Canada. The PPC starting as a party in Canada with a bunch of conservatives who found themselves homeless when Maxime Bernier was, like Bernie Sanders, probably cheated out of the leadership of the party. Because at the time, if you go back and look at that leadership race, he lost by 1%. And what was it? It was the farmers, the dairy farmers and their cartel, the dairy farmer support, and the dispute over government control and management of the milk supply. That was the issue that cost Maxime Bernier the leadership. Andrew Scheer at the time promised to support the farmers and keep supply management in place. Maxime Bernier, a free market guy, more conservative, even, I guess you would say, a right wing, especially in his economic policies and his social policies as well. So he's very much on the conservative side of things, especially at that time. And because Scheer supported the farmers and a socialist approach to supply management of the milk, they supported him in the end, and they just pushed him just over to get the leadership, and Maxime Bernier left, fracturing the conservative movement in Canada, splintering it off, and creating today's modern People's Party of Canada, coming almost full circle. You also need to understand that it was populists from the United States, many of them farmers, who moved from the southern U.S. to Canada back in the early 1900s and brought with them this populist ideology and socialism. It was socialism that was brought to Canada really by many U.S. citizens at the time who emigrated to Canada because of the economic conditions, and they moved into provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta. A lot of people don't realize that that is really where the socialist movement in Canada got its start. And so today, we see the freedom movement and Maxime Bernier and the PPC. The PPC now has really attached itself in every respect to the freedom movement. They are symbiotic. And within that, there are different factions, different political ideologies present, to be sure. But all of them, all of the people involved, I think pretty much gravitated toward the populist movement and the PPC and the freedom movement and the different aspects of it because of civil liberties issues initially, especially during the pandemic. Now, when the PPC was formed, again, it was because they were homeless conservatives. But many of the planks in the party platform were populist in nature. From the beginning, it was a populist party, appealing to the common man. From the very beginning. And that carried forward into the pandemic. Civil liberties issues were at the fore in people's minds, and they gravitated more and more to the PPC, and there was a surge in support for not just the freedom movement, but the PPC as well. You saw it manifest itself at the freedom protest, the convoy in Ottawa just over a year ago. And in the federal election in Canada, where we saw Maxime Bernier gain a lot of ground and the PPC. Today, they sit at just under 4% in national support. And remember, how much support did the People's Party in the U.S. walk away with back in the 1800s? 8%. 8%. They captured 5 states. And within just a few years, they were able to send 8 members to Congress. James B. Weaver in 1892, 8% of the popular vote. %4 for the PPC in Canada right now. And in the last federal election, the party did gain more ground. It's stalling out, and I'll explain why it is stalling out right now. But here's Maxime Bernier on election night back in 2021.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Freedom, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. My friends, today we made history. Mes amis, aujourd'hui, nous avons fait l'histoire. Canadian politics will never be the same again. When we started this campaign 5 weeks ago, everybody thought we would only be a footnote. At the beginning, the media did not even cover us. And then they had to start paying attention. Yes, they have to start paying attention because thousands of Canadians were coming to our rallies all across the country. Everywhere we looked, you could see purple, a purple wave, a sea of purple. My friends, this is not just a political party. It is a movement. It is an ideological revolution that we are starting now. Today, over 1 million Canadians said they've had enough. Enough of this COVID hysteria. Enough of the flattening our rights and freedoms. Enough of the massive spending, deficit, and government overreaching. Enough of the lies of establishment politicians. Like me, they are mad. They are mad. They want to have their normal lives back. They don't want the tyrannical Chinese model that you admire, Mr. Prime Minister. They don't want that. Les autres, yeah, we want freedom and we will have freedom. Les autres partis sont tous en faveur des confinements du
So that was 2021 and Maxime Bernier making reference to freedom. At the time, for full transparency, I was involved with the party at the time. I was helping to run a campaign. And even without real direction from the party, it became very clear to me that freedom had to be at the core of the campaign, that we needed to focus on that. And we did. And the campaign that I was involved with, the candidate was extremely successful. Didn't get elected, but did tie the NDP, New Democratic Party, for support in the riding that I'm in. Huge achievement. But what does freedom mean? It wasn't really defined by Maxime Bernier. It's never really defined by many people or anybody. People just embrace the term. And the populist movement I think today is really a rebranded populist movement. They're calling it the freedom movement. It's really a populist movement. And then there's a sub-movement within that. And I would say that at the core right now, the freedom movement has a common law element that is percolating, spreading. It's at the heart of a lot, maybe at the heart of the whole thing. I showed this chart some time ago. Some people lost their minds when I showed it. I'm going to show it again. It's some people call it a spaghetti chart. It's still available online. It's still up. It's a Coggle map or a flow chart. I still do not know really who made this. But this chart was made a long time ago. I won't get into the dating here tonight, but it has all the players pretty much, as far as I can tell, listed on this thing. And what's it called? It's about the freedom movement, but the title of it, right there in the center, Sovereign Citizen Infiltration. This is an element of populism today that certainly deserves attention, because in Canada and in the US, it forms a big part of what the freedom movement is. Most people not really even aware, I don't think, that they're attaching themselves to a movement that has at its core a common law movement, an initiative And if you look here, it lists these different groups, organizations, all of them associated with the freedom movement. And a lot of them, like Robert Menard, is the founder of the Freemen on the Land, which is the sovereign citizen / common law movement. Part of that. Unify the people. Alberta for liberty. Stand for thee. Arthur Pawlowski, who is now part of or was until he was just kicked out, the Independence Party out in Alberta, another organization that really has common law at its core, part of the freedom movement. Oh, hang on, I lost the page there. Just go over the list. Go over this chart. Somebody took a lot of time to put this thing together, but it lists all these different groups, all the different players, and many of them common law groups. And over time, as the freedom movement has evolved, and I would say devolved, at the core, this has been sort of exposed, for lack of a better word. It has revealed what was really at the core of the whole thing from the very beginning, which is these common law groups, Action for Canada. And it's interesting to see that they consistently use the number 4 in their names, the titles of these organizations. And they have become more and more organized over time. Honestly, I couldn't understand why people kind of lost their minds when I showed this the very first time. It's just a chart. To me, I thought it was kind of benign. I was just trying to understand what it was and maybe who made it and why. And the next thing you know, I had people threatening to sue me. This has been the strangest thing. And then over here, you have a list of most, if not all, of the major players in the Freedom Convoy that went to Ottawa. Canada United, James Bowder. He's been on the show. Nice fella. And then all these freedom convoyers, and listed on here as well, the People's Party of Canada. It's not a crime to be on here. I don't know why people are freaking out about it. It's just a flow chart. I don't know who made it. I've heard people suggest this person made it or that person made it, but we really don't know. I think really some people don't want people to see this. I think it's because, and I'm speculating, I'd like to deal in facts, but in this particular case, I just think that there's some people who just didn't want to be associated with or didn't want people to realize or know that at the core of all this, there's definitely a strong common law element. I think they've been using the freedom movement, the network, the organization, to spread their ideology, going to different freedom events, speaking at these different engagements, holding seminars. They've been using the freedom movement to spread their ideas, their movement, the common law movement, sovereign citizens movement. That's really what is at the very heart of the freedom movement. Now, I think it was thus from the beginning. It's just that when people went to Ottawa, so many just regular people who weren't directly affiliated with any of those groups came out by the thousands and thousands, and it sort of masked all of that. People didn't really see it for what it is. And here's a strange thing. On this chart, there's a link. There are a bunch of links on this chart. And I noticed this one today. It takes you to, well, hang on a second here. It takes you to a PDF of a document talking about the sovereign citizens movement and common law. They call it the myth of common law. And I found this document quite interesting. I read it really for the first time today. I hadn't really paid much attention to this particular link, but here it comes. It's going to come up on the screen here now. There it is. And I'm not sure why it's on this chart, but it's right above on the left-hand side. And it says here, sovereign citizens, freemen on the land, now more commonly known under the new branding of common law, have been a concern for police and courts for over 100 years. Note the terminology chosen for the new branding of common law has nothing to do with the current legal system of common law, judge-made case law in Canada. True, common law case law is the legal framework for most Canadian provinces other than Quebec and the UK. The only other legal system is that of Quebec. The US and countries such as Switzerland, which is based on civil law statutes, common law groups have become a credible and growing threat to national security and civilized society using COVID as the spark. Followers of these groups typically fit into 3 categories. These are not my words. This is a document posted online attached to that Coggle map flowchart. Category 1, plain irritants who get themselves into trouble due to a serious lack of understanding of the legal and taxation system. In the current climate, this results in people losing everything rather than being able to defend themselves properly through the existing system. This can also result in rapid escalations of confrontations that put everyone in danger. Let's call these followers dreamers. Category 2, scam artists selling common law or sovereign citizen packages like identity cards, notices of liability that I've talked about on here, common law birth certificates, allodial titles, etc. Victims of this group can become any of the 3 categories as they move through the fraudulent belief system. At best, victims fall into the first category, dreamers, but now have been scammed out of their hard-earned savings to boot. Let's call this second category schemers. Category 3, the more serious from a security and policing basis are the third category, the true believers. They are designated as domestic terrorists per se. Actually, all of these 3 categories are tracked and monitored. Followers of this myth can move into this area very quickly, and it is impossible for law enforcement to segregate one from the other. This group of followers truly believe that rather than disagree with the government or laws, they are above them. As such, they have killed, kidnapped, and assaulted police, judges, politicians, the general public, and more. They have even blown up pipelines and committed many other de facto terrorist acts because they don't believe the current laws apply to them. Groups 2 and 3, it says here, are the most dangerous because they are not obvious. This makes me think that this may have been created, this chart may have been created by police, but I do not know. Again, that is speculative. I've often thought of another person who might have created it too, who I won't name because I don't have any proof. And I really honestly do not know who made that chart. And I don't know who wrote this. But it is insightful. It goes on to talk about the common law advocates saying they use many games to pretend they are something else. The public don't really understand it. As proponents of this cult, and that is exactly what it is, it says here, use the pitch to hook someone in, much like a timeshare pitch or a cult sermon. Right now, it goes on. It says there are many groups playing games and taking advantage of the chaos of the COVID response and the public's fear of the government response. Just like the government, these groups are capitalizing on the COVID crisis and fear to further these schemes and insane beliefs. Whether these groups care to admit it or not, they pose a more significant threat to the public than the government themselves right now. The way that's phrased, I'm not sure that that would be written by a cop. No serving or retired police officer or judge will support them, even though we hear repeatedly from people involved in the common law movement or the sovereign citizen movement that they expect the police to drop their handcuffs and badges, turn their backs on the system, and switch sides. Those are my words. Whether you want to believe it or not, we will need the police and judiciary on our side if we are to survive without bloodshed and have any hope of ending this once and for all. You can find many resources on common law, the new and far more insidious marketing branding for sovereign citizens, or organized pseudo-legal commercial arguments, OPCA, as the judiciary has grouped them. So ask yourself just who are the groups you are aligning with. So that is not written by a cop. And then there are all these different links. And then there is that landmark case, Meads versus Meads, that Catherine, the lawyer who we had on the program talking about common law many months ago, referred to. And we went over that in great detail. I did read that case law. I did familiarize myself with it at the time. And then there are links here to the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, FBI links, scholarly articles from the primary legal advisors to the Court of Queen's Bench in Alberta. It says here, if you have done your homework on insane COVID response, why have you not done your homework on the myth that is common law? Very interesting stuff. And I have seen, honestly, this common law ideology take a greater and greater hold within the freedom movement. And it's become more and more exposed as these seminars have influenced more and more people within the movement. I talk to people who really have no legal training or no background in history. They're completely smitten with it. They have embraced it. I personally don't agree with it. Now, if people want to believe in it, you think that there's merit, have at it. As long as you remain peaceful. Well, I have no objections. People are free to pursue whatever political goals they choose to pursue. And for me, it's just another aspect of the freedom movement. I don't particularly agree with this aspect of it. But the movement is evolving. There's no question about that. And as I said, I think it is actually, in many respects, devolving. And I don't think don't think in a good way in some respects, because a lot of the normal, everyday, common people, the actual common people who came out to support the freedom movement in Ottawa at the convoy, and people who were really upset during the lockdowns, and some of the people who still are upset have sort of drifted away because they've gone back to their regular lives and they're working every day. But there are other people who continue to try to drive it forward, keep the whole freedom movement thing going. They keep trying to organize convoys and do all this stuff. And then this past weekend, there was that rally that I showed you in Shelburne, Ontario. Well, I want to show you the parade that the freedom movement had in Shelburne, Ontario. And maybe this will give you a little bit more perspective on where things have, I would say, devolved. This was considered referred to as a great success. And this is just shot raw. This is from Karima Assad, the lawyer. She's not well liked, honestly, by the people in the freedom movement that tell her to get lost all the time. But she is what she is, and I think she's actually pretty funny. She's a political satirist, and I think she is funny. And all she had to do here was just shoot this parade. Just watch this.
All right, guys, so we do have some events. We're going to go up 2 streets and turn on the center street. Can you do this? Jeremy, can you do it? To the left? Yeah, to the left. All right, stay in one lane, guys. Stay in one lane. All right. All right, children. We are not the fringe minority. We are the people. And the people have had enough. Come and join us because vaccinated or not, we have every right to. You know.
Queen's Park? What? Queen's Park, nothing.
Okay, we're good. We're good.
The wagon, the kid's wagon at the end with the skeleton. Oh boy.
Hello, world. Hello, world. Hello, world. Are you awake? Uniting humankind by liberating millions of minds at a time. Maverick News. The world is watching.
The New World Order. Government overreach. The Great Reset. Mainstream media lies. Now more than ever, independent voices are needed. Donate now, at freedomreporters.com. That's freedomreporters.com. Maverick News. The antivirus program. For your mind.
Sorry, everything's sluggish here suddenly with the internet. I can't imagine why. Yeah. Anyway, I thought the skeleton was hilarious. I thought it was funny. I will say this, if we're going to achieve anything, I think we need to do a little better. you can assess for yourselves. It was funny. Anyway, folks, it's 8:40 p.m. and I'm not taking any calls tonight. No, not tonight. I'm sorry if you can't see the humor in that, then you don't have a sense of humor. It was funny. I appreciate everybody spending the time here tonight. There's where we're at with populism today, and I'm glad I can at least smile about it at the end, right? I'm glad they brought a little humor. Thought it was funny. So as I say, I think that it's stalled. What I've just laid out for you was the rise and the stall of populism. But I think that, at any moment it could get kickstarted again. There is still a movement there, a populist movement / freedom movement. I think, though, in Canada, well, in the US as well, we saw the freedom movement sort of fall apart in the US with infighting when the People's Convoy, as they called it, it self-destructed. A lot of fighting. And now we're seeing all this infighting within the freedom movement in Canada, as well as we see different groups fighting over the money and the, who should get the assistance for legal fees. And you're seeing splintering and fighting within the movement because, as I say, you're attracting people from different political ideologies. You've got some conservatives in there. You have socialists. You probably have some communists. You have libertarian Marxists. You have outright anarchists. I know for a fact that you have actual anarchists in there, and you have this very strong common law element within the movement, right at the very heart of it, that has been there from the very beginning. And the People's Party of Canada, that also is, I think, really very much at the center of this, and always has been. The People's Party of Canada, I think, has latched onto it as well. And they're using this network of common law groups and freedom groups as a large part of its party base of support. In the US side, you're seeing populism express itself through not just Trump, but I would argue even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who now has announced that he's going to run, or is going to give us the details on how he's going to run for the Democratic nomination and then for president. I think he's very much a populist. And his platform very much aligns with what you see within the freedom movement in Canada and the US. His stance on the vaccines, his stance, I think, on the war in Ukraine, his economic policies very much aligned with the interests of the common person. It's the same thing, I think, very much with Trump. At least that's the way that he expresses himself to the public. And make no mistake, you're going to see a shift in the rhetoric, I think, from the Democrat side, the Democratic Party. Even if RFK Jr. is not the nominee, there's already talk now, and maybe in response to RFK launching his bid for the White House, there's talk of Gavin Newsom being the man that the Democrats really will put their support behind. I think that might just be the case. The Democrats may already be lined up, the machine, the Democrat machine might be behind Newsom. We've seen reports in that regard over the last day. And when you listen to the way he speaks, his rhetoric is very much focused on, get this, freedom and rights. This coming from a guy who locked everybody down pretty hard as governor of California, man. He doesn't mean it. It's a joke. But the rhetoric is powerful, and he recognizes, understands that in order to solicit support from the general population right now, it's that populist rhetoric that will get you the votes. He knows that if he's the nominee, and even to get the nomination, he'll excel. He'll generate a lot of support by using that kind of language, the same kind of populist rhetoric that we hear from Maxime Bernier, Donald Trump, RFK Jr. Just say a lot of the same things in just a slightly different way, or maybe even the same way. You don't have to mean it. Because even if you say those things that are, you talk about freedom, again, it's a very abstract idea. So you can say, I'm all for freedom, and then lock everybody down. And he's going to get those Democrats to vote for him anyway. So he can even wrap the freedom banner around himself. He'll still get the Democrat votes because he's got a D beside his name. And he'll peel off a lot of that support that Trump would have on the Republican side. And even use that against RFK because he's got the machine behind him, the Democrat machine. And if he talks about freedom, he'll peel off some support from RFK Jr. I think that's the way I'm reading it at the moment. Things could certainly shift and change as we get more speeches over time and the race for the White House heats up. But it is interesting to see even someone like Gavin Newsom adopt populist rhetoric. Populism. It's a strong political force, certainly present right now. And I'm just reading the comments here. I don't know. Someone's telling me I should read the comments. Mouth is telling me I should read the comments. 420 show. Anyway. But yeah, and there's Lori. She says, yeah, beware of fake populists. Going to be lots of them emerging. Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly right. I think so. Yeah, I think RFK Jr. is the real deal. I think with him, you what you see is what you get. With Gavin Newsom, it's a mirror image. It's like the opposite. That's my assessment of that guy. I don't know. See, I think some Trump fans might, but they're not the hardcore Trumpers. They're the they're the soft ones. They're the ones who are being critical right now. They're the left-wing socialist types. Maybe it's the vaccine issue. Who knows? It could be a lot of things that, there's some things that are costing Trump some political support. And Rising Dragon says if we do a weed show, he wants Mouth to let him know. Okay, well, we'll try to let you know. And this guy, that's fact. This computer's slowing down. I don't know why. Maybe it's the internet. Mouth of the South, get Rick stoned. Yeah. Not likely. I don't do that. I don't drink. I don't do any drugs. I honestly don't. It's just not my thing. I like to keep my head clear. I've always kind of been that way. Where he says, RFK Jr. is the real deal. DeSantis, not so much. I don't know. I like DeSantis. I do. I think he's done an excellent job as governor in California. I think, honestly, he's in many respects been more effective at defending freedom and defending people's rights than Trump has been. And Mr. Boffin's Dust Teep says, Lori, maybe because the Americans invaded and killed Isaac Brock when he was charging up Queenston Heights and billeted themselves at Laura Secords, causing her to walk through a snake-infested swamp. Don't know where that came from, but sounds credible, I guess. Not sure I have the right context on that or the back story. Lori says, haha, we should get Rick stoned on 420. I don't think he's ever smoked a joint in his life. I am pretty straight-laced, it's true. I am. Yeah. I've been drunk, but I didn't like it. I don't like it. I'm not good at it. Cheap date, Rick. Yeah. And Lori, she's on a roll. She says DeSantis is a neocon in MAGA disguise. May well be. Yeah. May well be. And this stupid computer, it's sluggish tonight. Come on, come up on the screen. There's Deborah Hart. Well, thank you for the super sticker, Deborah. I really appreciate that. Mother of the South says, let the people choose. Wouldn't I in that way be giving up my bodily autonomy? I think so. Anyway, folks, it's now 8:53. I am going to wrap things up. Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking with me tonight. I hope I didn't drone on too much. It is a subject that I did want to talk about, and I hope you found it useful, and I hope it gave you some new perspective. You can support the channel if you're so inclined at freedomreporters.com. You can donate there. For those of you who have donated through the super chat, greatly, greatly appreciate that. Helps keep us on the air. It's the only way we pay the bills around here. If you haven't liked and shared, please consider doing that. Please subscribe to the channel. Please, please, please subscribe, even on YouTube. Make sure you hit the notification bell. We're still live and kicking on YouTube, at least for now. One of our channels got permanently banned or something, and then the other channel is still on a ban. We'll get that back, I think, within the next week. And the main channel, as you're watching tonight, is still up and running. Please consider liking and subscribing and hit the notification bell. Please consider subscribing over on Rumble, where we are growing and gaining real traction. Appreciate that. And for those of you who don't share my views, I also appreciate you guys for sticking with the channel and watching. And as long as people are not too disruptive in the chat, I try not to ban people, but you know what that's all about. I do appreciate people sticking here because I do try to bring people on with opposing points of view on political issues as well. So we've had people with all kinds of different views on the show, and I always welcome that too, because we do believe in free speech and a variety of opinions. And another special thank you to Steve from last night. because that was a very good conversation. It ended up being a better conversation than I really expected it was going to be. I wasn't looking forward to talking to him when he called in last night because I just thought it was going to go sideways and get a little crazy, but it really didn't. It ended up being a good discussion, and I appreciate his patience with me in that way. So thank you very much, Steve. I will be back tomorrow night, same time, same channel, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on the Maverick News channel, where we have the antivirus programs for your mind.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.